Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the wooden, creaking world of Tudor classrooms where the smell of ink, sweat, and chalk dust lingers in the cold air. And discipline is less about gentle correction and more about testing how much humiliation and stinging skin a small body can endure. You sit on a splintered bench, the rough wood pressing into the back of your thighs, and the chill stone floor beneath you makes your toes curl. A heavy silence hangs, broken only by the steady scrape of quills across parchment and the occasional cough from a boy too nervous to make a sound. At the front stands the master, his long robe frayed at the hem, his hand never far from the birch rod resting against the lectern like a loyal guard dog. And here's your first reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this school day. Forget modern ideas of timeouts and let's talk about your feelings. Here, your feelings are about to be flattened, long with your knuckles if you dare to slip. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where are you listening from tonight. Post your location and the time in the comments, and let's see just how many sleepy travelers are joining from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you trudge forward, your shoes scuffing the dusty floor, and settle in with the boys of a Tudor grammar school. Latin is the language of power here, and every mistake in your declensions is like a step closer to pain. Your lips try to form the alien syllables, MOA, AMAs, ematand. Your tongue trips, just as it always does. The master's eyes narrow. You can almost feel the crackle of anticipation as the rod shifts in his grip. The schoolroom smells faintly of damp wool and old bread. Light pours in from narrow windows, the glass uneven, casting strange ripples on the walls. It is barely enough illumination for your eyes to follow the cramped black letters scratched into the horn-covered primer. A rooster crows faintly outside. But the students ignore it. Nature holds no authority here compared to the man with the rod. You notice the desks are not really desks at all, more like makeshift planks with inkwells clumsily drilled into them. Every boy hunches over, shoulders stiff, trying to make himself invisible. One poor soul coughs again, and the sound echoes louder than thunder in this silence. The master lifts his head, peers through wiry brows, and the room freezes. The boy goes red, swallows, and clasps his hands in silent prayer that no punishment comes. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Not every master favored the rod alone. Some preferred tossing a shoe across the room like a medieval dodgeball. Champion, though without the cheering crowds. Historians still argue whether these shoe throws were common practice or just the stuff of later exaggeration. But you picture yourself ducking under the sudden whiz of a leather boot sailing past. Your ear, not exactly the gentle encouragement you'd hope for. You glance at the walls. They are bare, not like modern classrooms, decorated with inspirational posters and world maps. No shoot for the stars banner here, unless by stars you mean the sparks that dance in your eyes when you're smacked across the head. Instead, the only decoration is the rod itself, polished from use, and perhaps a small cross hanging crookedly above the master's desk. Religion, after all, is never far from learning in Tudor England. The master begins to pace. His shoes click softly against the stone. You sense his approach before you see it. A boy in front of you fumbles with his quill, blotting ink onto the page. A gasp escapes his lips, too loud, too careless. In an instant, the master swoops. The rod lifts. A short, sharp crack follows. The boy winces, but does not cry out. Tears threaten, but he swallows them, determined not to show weakness. The room, as one, stares harder at their pages, desperate to avoid eye contact. There is a strange rhythm to this world, almost like a grim music. The scratch of quills, the sigh of cold breath, the sudden crack of wood against skin, then silence. Again, you feel yourself sinking into it, lulled in a way though. You remind yourself that you are lucky, very lucky, to be only a visitor here. The punishments aren't always immediate. Sometimes they are promised saved up like dreadful treasures to be delivered at the day's end. That means you spend every hour with the rod hovering in your imagination, every mistake tallying itself on an invisible chalkboard until the reckoning arrives. And strangely, that looming promise can be worse than the blow itself. The air in the schoolroom grows heavy, stale with the combined nerves of 20 children. You glance toward the small fireplace in the corner. The embers glow faintly, not nearly enough to warm the vast cold room. A few children closest to it edge their boots nearer, savoring the fleeting comfort. But you, seated further back, can only dream of warmth. Your ink stiffens, your fingers grow numb, and your Latin refuses to obey your frozen hand. You whisper the words again, amo, amas, amat. Behind you, someone mutters the wrong syllable. The master's ears, sharper than a hound's, catch it instantly. A swift turn, a glare, a step forward, and another student meets the rod. Oddly enough, there's an almost bureaucratic neatness to it all. The punishments are not random, not wild, but part of the schoolroom's structure, as expected as prayers or mealtime. Some historians still argue whether the severity we imagine today is exaggerated by later reformers trying to prove how far we've come. Perhaps, they suggest, it was more ritual than cruelty, yet to the small boy rubbing his stinging knuckles, it probably did not feel like mere ritual. The lesson drones on. Latin verbs pile up like stones in your mind, heavy and unyielding. The cold bites harder. The rod rests briefly against the master's shoulder, like a hunter's spear waiting for the next slip. You exhale, slow and shaky, and wonder how many more hours this day holds. You sit there in the stiff-backed bench, fingers still tingling from the cold, and your eyes are drawn again and again to the birch rod resting casually in the master's hand. It is not thick, not heavy like a cudgel, no. Its cruelty lies in the fact that it is thin, flexible, and eager to sting. Each switch of the rod has been peeled carefully from the birch tree, bundled into a neat cluster, tied at the base with twine. A fresh one, by the look of it, pale and smooth, cut only yesterday. You realize that this rod is not just an object, but a constant reminder, as visible as a teacher's chalk today. The rod is both lesson plan and grading rubric, and everyone here knows it by heart. When a boy stumbles over his Latin conjugations, perhaps saying amo, amates, amat instead of amo, amas, amat, the master does not sigh or gently correct him. Instead, the rod sings through the air with a sharp hiss, followed by the sharp smack against small knuckles. You watch the boy jolt, eyes watering, his lips pressing tight to stop any sound from escaping. He knows that to cry is to earn more. Lashes, the skin reddens almost instantly, little welts rising like pink ridges on the pale surface. And yet the lesson goes on, as if nothing happened. There's a sort of dark comedy here if you squint. You think of modern grading, red pens, and see me after class. Imagine if instead Every misplaced comma meant a sting across your hand. Your essays would be immaculate, at least until your fingers swelled so much you couldn't hold the quill anymore. A quirky fact drifts into your thoughts. Some birch rods were soaked in brine before use, supposedly to make them more durable and add to the sting. Whether that really happened in every school, historians still argue. Some claim it's an exaggeration, a scare story passed along by reformers in later centuries. Others insist that yes, salted rods were very much a thing. Tudor children knew the difference instantly. Either way, the idea of your punishment being marinated before delivery adds a layer of absurdity you cannot help but smirk at. The master doesn't just strike knuckles. Sometimes it's the palm, outstretched flat, trembling in the air like a bird waiting for the inevitable. Sometimes it's across the back of the legs, just above the knee where the skin is tender. And sometimes, if the offense is deemed grave enough, like speaking out of turn or failing to memorize the psalm of the Datha rod might, leave a more lasting memory across the shoulders. You shift uncomfortably in your own seat, your body tensing at each swing, even though you are only a ghostly visitor here. The crack of the rod, the quick intake of breath from the punished, the rustle of the others trying to vanish into silence, it all weaves together into the soundtrack of Tudor education. But punishment is not always physical. Often it is the anticipation that does the real work. Imagine sitting with your hands clasped, knowing you have made a mistake earlier in the lesson, and that the master has promised a reckoning at the end of the day. You would trace every syllable with perfect care, your mind pounding louder than the church bells outside. The boy beside you scribbles too quickly, smears ink, and swallows hard. He knows, you know, the master knows. The rod waits patiently. There's a cultural pride in this severity too. Parents believed a child's spirit had to be bent, reshaped, beaten into discipline. The Bible itself was quoted to justify it. Spare the rod and spoil the child. The phrase hung over every Tudor classroom like an invisible motto, more powerful than any coat of arms. And if you think your own parents were strict when you left your socks on the floor, well, at least they weren't citing scripture before smacking you with a salted stick. The classroom is filled with tiny rituals that make the rod's presence all the more inevitable. Each morning begins with prayers, heads bowed, hands clasped. Each lesson begins with recitation, words drummed into memory by endless repetition, and each slip in that rhythm, every stumble, every pause, till long becomes a beat in the master's counter rhythm, rod raised, rod dropped, rod reset. The discipline feels almost musical. If music could sting. Another quirky tidbit. Some boys try to outwit the rod by stuffing their sleeves with scraps of cloth or even slipping a bit of leather under their tunics. But masters were not fools. They quickly caught on, lifting sleeves and tugging collars, exposing the secret padding. Those who tried and failed often earned double. So yes, cheating on your homework was bad, but cheating the rod was practically a death wish. And yet, despite the pain, despite the dread, there's an odd sense of pride in enduring it. A boy who survives without tears earns a kind of silent respect. To endure is to be strong, to show you are fit to enter the wider Tudor world, a world filled with blows from more than just birch rods. After all, life outside the classroom is hardly gentle. Poverty, disease, cold winters, and harsh masters of every kind await. The rod is just a rehearsal. Historians still argue whether this pride was genuine or simply enforced silence. Did Tudor children truly accept the rod as part of their world, or have later storytellers romanticized their stoicism? You lean toward, believing the children themselves felt the sting far more than the dignity. But the debate lingers in the background like a shadow, one more mystery of a time when cruelty and education were tightly knotted together. The rod rests again, leaned casually against the lectern. It looks harmless now, just a cluster of twigs bound together. And yet the way every child's eyes flick toward it, the way every posture stiffens when the master's hand brushes against it, tells you the rod has more authority than any textbook. It is the silent headmaster, always watching, always ready to sing its thin, sharp song. You glance at your own hand, phantom knuckles tingling with imagined pain. You whisper a Latin word correctly this time, just to be safe. Better not to tempt fate. You glance across the classroom again, and this time your eyes land on something almost comical, if it weren't so humiliating. The dreaded dunce cap, a simple cone of stiff paper, sometimes painted with crude drawings or scrawled words like fool. It sits waiting on a stool in the corner. You know, the way a child might dread being sent to the principal's office today. Tudor boys feared that stool and that cone, not because it hurt their skin, but because it burned their pride. Picture it. A boy forgets the next line of Latin or bungles the multiplication tables. The master sighs, sets the rod aside for once, and reaches for the cone. Slowly, deliberately, he places it on the boy's head, the sharp point towering upward like a mocking crown. The class titters, half out of relief that it isn't them, half out of genuine amusement. You feel your cheeks heat on the boy's behalf, because what could be worse than sitting in silence while your friends steal side glances and giggle? The symbolism isn't lost on you. The cone marks you as a fool. Your punishment, not the sting of the rod, but the sting of shame. And shame, as every Tudor school child learns, can linger far longer than bruises. It is social punishment, a weapon of ridicule. Even today, the phrase dunce cap survives as shorthand for stupidity. Imagine your mistakes literally written on your forehead, broadcast to the world. Latin itself fuels many of these punishments. You repeat it again, amo, amas, amat, one slip of syllables, and suddenly your head is weighted by paper humiliation. Boys spend hours memorizing long lists of declensions, rules, and irregular verbs. The irony, of course, is that very few would ever need Latin outside of school, unless you were destined for the church or the law. Those endless lines of hic, heck, hoc would gather dust in your mind. And yet, forgetting even one line could summon the cone. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some schoolmasters use different hats for different offences. One cap might read idle, another talker, and a third perhaps something like dreamer. In one record, a boy who yawned too often was forced to wear a cap with donkey ears attached. Whether every school kept a wardrobe of humiliating headgear, historians still argue. Some accounts make it sound like classrooms were half lessons, half costume shops. Imagine yourself perched on that stool, the cap slipping awkwardly down over your forehead. The master insists you sit there through the lesson, maybe even through lunch. Every time you shift, the paper crinkles, announcing your foolishness like a squeaky trumpet. Your hands itch to pull it off, but you dare not remove it earns. You, the rod on top of the shame. Not all caps were plain. Some were decorated with feathers or bells, meant to add an extra jab of mockery. You think of a child shuffling home in the afternoon, still wearing the cone because the master chose not to remove it. The laughter from the street would follow him all the way back to his family's hearth. The bruise of laughter, as you know, fades far more slowly than the bruise of wood. And then there are the Latin slips themselves. Forget a word, mix up a declension, mispronounce a verb. The punishment could be as minor as the cap, or as major as the rod. Sometimes both. The boys live in constant tension, their lips moving silently in rehearsed prayers that their memory will not fail them. Memory, after all, is everything here? To forget is not simply a mistake, is a moral failing. But here's the thing. Historians still argue whether the dunce cap was quite as common in Tudor schools as later law makes it seem. Some claim it was exaggerated, a Victorian caricature of the bad old days. Others insist it was standard, especially in grammar schools where masters favoured humiliation over bruises for smaller offences. So you sit in the shadow of uncertainty, the paper cone hovering between reality and myth. Still, you can feel its weight, heavy not because of paper, but because of the snickers, the pointing fingers, the sly grins from the boy beside you who now seems positively brilliant by comparison. Your hands sweat, your face burns, and you keep your gaze locked on the floor. Because looking up means meeting those eyes, and those eyes mean remembering that you are the fool of the hour. Oddly enough, some boys seemed to embrace the role. A class clown, centuries before the word existed, a boy might play up his punishment, making faces from beneath the cone, turning ridicule into his own private stage. Did it earn him harsher lashes later? Almost certainly, but for that moment, laughter belonged to him. You can't help but admire the courage or, perhaps the foolishness, of taking a weapon meant to shame and twisting it into performance. The dunce cap waits still on its stool. The rod leans silent against the desk. Both tools of punishment, both different in kind but not in power. One bruises the body, the other the ego. You wonder, which would you prefer? A few sharp smacks that fade by morning, or the memory of sitting under the cone, forever the boy with the fool's crown? Your eyes drift from the paper cone on the stool to something smaller, more immediate, and frankly more painful in its own petty way. Punishments delivered with nothing more than a teacher's fingers. The birch rod might sting, the dunce cap might humiliate, but sometimes the master prefers to make his point up close. Ear pulling, nose twisting, cheek pinching, these little bursts of pain are the punctuation marks of a Tudor lesson. You imagine it now. You mispronounce Rex as race, and before you can even correct yourself, the master's hand shoots out, his fingers pinch the soft curve of your ear and tug upward. The world tilts. Your body rises on tiptoe, trying desperately to ease the pressure, but there is no escape until he lets go. The pain is sharp, immediate, and fleeting, but the heat lingers. Your ear feels twice its size, glowing red, as though it's advertising your shame to the entire room. And then there's the nose twist. Perhaps you've let your mind wander, your eyes drift to the window where a bird hops along the sill. Far more interesting than Latin The master sees. His hand clamps down, thumb and forefinger gripping the bridge of your nose. He gives it a firm twist, just enough to make your eyes water. The class chuckles under their breath, because somehow this punishment looks ridiculous, even as it stings. You sniff, eyes watering, cheeks burning, and force yourself back into focus. One quirky tidbit. Some Tudor accounts describe masters flicking boys on the forehead with their middle finger, swift snap that made a hollow pop sound. It was said to clear the mind. Whether it truly sharpened attention or just made the unlucky student look stunned and cross-eyed, historians still argue. But you can picture it clearly, the teacher lining up his shot like a bowman, then letting fly with a sharp flick that echoes in the quiet room. The thing about these finger-based punishments is their intimacy. The rod could be swung from a distance. The cap could be set upon you and left alone. But an ear pull, a nose twist, a forehead flick, these happen close, face to face, eye to eye. The master looms into your space, his breath tickling your cheek, his authority invading your very skin. It's personal, uncomfortably so. And yet, these small torments carry less risk than the rod. A bruise across the knuckles might draw the attention of parents, though many approved of it, some did not. But an ear tug leaves no lasting mark, just a moment of sting. It is discipline delivered quietly, almost invisibly, but powerfully nonetheless. You watch as another boy, fidgeting too much with his quill, earns a sudden pinch of the cheek. His face jerks sideways, lips squished awkwardly between the master's fingers. He doesn't cry, but his dignity does. The class, tense as ever, suppresses. A ripple of laughter. The master smirks faintly, satisfied with his quick correction. And just like that, the lesson resumes. You might laugh now, thinking of a modern teacher twisting ears in the middle of class. Lawsuits would pile up faster than ink blots on cheap paper. But here it is accepted, routine, even expected. The small pains train bodies as much as minds. Keep still, keep focused, keep silent. Historians debate whether these petty punishments were meant as true cruelty or simply convenient tools. Were they acts of temper, teachers losing patience and lashing out with whatever was closest to an ear, a nose, a forehead? Or were they deliberate methods, part of the accepted toolkit of discipline? The line blurs, as lines so often do in Tudor classrooms. Imagine enduring a day filled not just with the looming rod, but with constant little jabs. Your ear tugged 1 hour, your nose twisted the next, a forehead flick before lunch. By evening, your skin is sore all over, not from one dramatic punishment, but from dozens of small indignities. It's like being nibbled by a school of fish, never fatal, but never letting you forget where you are. And still, there is a strange humor in it. You picture a boy with one ear bright red, his nose pink and swollen, his cheek still marked from a pinch, sitting there trying to look serious as he conjugates verbs. He looks less like a scholar and more like someone who just lost a very silly bar fight. If only he could see himself. Perhaps, in some small way, the absurdity kept the children from breaking completely under the weight of it. The master's hand hovers again. Another slip, another flick. A classroom chorus of sniffles, red ears, and watery eyes carries on, blending. With the drone of Latin, you sit very still, shoulders tense, silently grateful that tonight you only have to watch. Your eyes drift lower now, down past the faces flushed from nose twists and the ears still burning, toward the floor itself. There, you spot a crueler form of punishment: kneeling. Not simply kneeling politely, as in prayer, but kneeling on. Something deliberately designed to bite into the skin. A pile of dried peas. Yes, peas. Hard, shriveled, pebble-like little seeds spread in a small mound on the ground. A boy, caught whispering to his neighbor, is ordered forward. He shuffles, head low, while the others lean back to watch. The master gestures briskly, and the boy sinks down onto the peas. At first, it seems manageable, but within seconds, the truth sets in. The peas dig into his knees like dozens of tiny stones, pressing sharp points against thin fabric, piercing through to tender flesh. The boy squirms, but dares not rise. He clasps his hands together and stares at the floorboards, trying to will the pain away. The air grows heavy with his discomfort. Each passing minute stretches endlessly. You feel your own knees ache in sympathy, as if you too are kneeling on that unforgiving little pile. And here's the cruel trick. The longer you kneel, the worse it gets. Your muscles cramp, your weight bears down, and the peas grind deeper. A simple handful of dried legumes becomes a slow torture, quiet but merciless dot sometimes, when no peas were handy. The punishment took another form, kneeling on bare wooden boards sprinkled with grit, or even directly on the cold, rough flagstones of the classroom. Imagine the chill seeping into your bones, the hardness bruising your skin. The humiliation is compounded by the stillness. Everyone else goes on with their lessons, quills scratching away, while you remain a statue of discomfort. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some records mention children being forced to kneel not only on peas, but also on broom bristles or sharp nutshells. Whether that was widespread or just a few particularly inventive masters, historians still argue. But the image lingers, the tiny scrape of shells or the jab of stiff bristles under your weight. Each movement sending another jab through your knees. There's a rhythm to this punishment too. It isn't always loud or dramatic like the rod. Instead, it's a slow burn, a steady drip of pain. At first, the boy shifts back and forth, trying to ease the sting. Then he stiffens, locking his body in place to avoid drawing further attention. His face flushes, his teeth clamp down. Every tick of the sundial outside feels like an eternity. You glance around the classroom and notice how the other boys react. Some smirk quietly, grateful it isn't them. Others look away, uneasy, their own knees aching in sympathy. A few whisper prayers, hoping they'll remember their Latin conjugations well enough to avoid the same fate. And then there's the silent dread of when. Often, the master doesn't say how long the kneeling will last. It might be 10 minutes. It might be an hour. It might stretch until the lesson ends. That uncertainty gnaws more than the peas themselves. How long can your knees hold? How much weight can you bear? Religion plays into it too. Kneeling, after all, is a posture of prayer. Forcing a child into it as punishment turns a sacred gesture into one of pain. There's an uncomfortable irony here. The same position meant to honor God twisted into a tool of humiliation. Some parents even approved of it as doubly beneficial, punishing disobedience while training piety. You think of your own knees sinking into a pew cushion at church, and you realize how luxurious even soft fabric is compared to dried legumes. Historians still argue whether the pea punishment was common across Tudor schools, or more of a rarity, recorded because of its bizarre cruelty. Was it an everyday occurrence, or just a sensational detail repeated for effect? Whatever the case, the image survives, so vivid, so peculiar, that you almost can't separate fact from legend anymore. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the scrape of stone under your skin, the slow throb building in your knees, the dull ache spreading upward into your thighs. You try to distract yourself by reciting your latenimo, amars, amat, but the syllables blur into the pulse of discomfort. The peas shift under your weight, pressing into new spots, and the ache sharpens all over again. At last, the master claps his hands, signaling the end. The boy rises gingerly, his legs stiff, his knees dotted with angry red impressions. He limps back to his seat, wincing with each step. No one speaks, but everyone sees. The peas are swept aside, waiting for their next victim. You sit very still, grateful once again that you are only visiting. The thought of those tiny green punishments burrowing into your knees makes you shift slightly on your own chair, grateful for the soft fabric beneath you. Strange, isn't it, how something so small can command so much fear? The room settles again after the kneeling ordeal, quills scratching, boys murmuring Latin verbs under their breath, and the faint smell of smoke drifting from the weak fireplace. You notice, though, that punishment does not always come in the form of pain. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence and enforced stillness that bites deeper than any rod. Picture this. The boys gather at the long wooden table for their midday meal. A loaf of coarse bread, perhaps a bowl of potager, thick stew of grains and vegetables sits before them. The fire has burned low, so the room feels even colder now, and stomachs rumble in the drafty air. Normally, there might be a quiet murmur of voices, boys whispering about lessons, or laughing at a smudge of ink on someone's cheek. But for one unlucky child, the master's hand shoots up in warning, no speaking. His crime, talking out of turn during class, or fidgeting too much with his quill. His sentence, a silent meal. You watch as the others break bread together, whispering in low tones, while the punished boy eats alone in sound, like a ghost at the table. His eyes dart around, desperate for inclusion, but no one dares speak to him. The bread tastes dry, the stew bland, and the silence stretches heavy. He is not just hungry for food, he is hungry for company. This punishment may seem gentle compared to the rod or the peas, but in a world where companionship is everything, silence cuts deep. These boys live in close quarters, study side by side, and share every moment of their days. To be exiled into silence is to be cast out, if only for an hour. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some schools even forbade punished children from gesturing during silent meals. If a boy tried to mime or signal, his hand might be slapped or his meal taken away entirely. Historians still argue whether this strictness was universal or limited to certain grammar schools with particularly zealous masters. But the idea is chilling. Even the twitch of a hand could betray you. The effect is not just punishment, it's humiliation, a performance of exclusion. The other children know you are different, marked by silence, and so the line between us and you is drawn more deeply. And yet, there's a certain cruel brilliance in it. No bruises, no marks to explain at home, just a quiet ache of loneliness, remembered long after the bread is gone. You glance around the room. The boys are careful now, chewing slowly, whispering only when the master's back is turned. Even laughter feels dangerous. The punished boy stares at his bowl, pushing bits of barley around with his spoon. The others glance at him occasionally, half sympathetic, half relieved. It isn't them. Imagine yourself there, your throat tight with unspoken words. Every time you want to join in, you remember the master's sharp gaze. So you swallow your stew, feeling the lump in your throat grow larger with each bite. You chew silently, ears straining for conversation you cannot join. Every word around you reminding you of your isolation, and silence, of course, is part of a larger system. The Tudor classroom itself is built on it. Boys recite when commanded, speak only when asked, laugh only in whispers. Silence is not just punishment, it is the baseline expectation. To break it is to invite the rod, the cone, or the long, lonely meal. Yet there is a paradox here. In church, silence is holy. In the classroom, silence is discipline. In punishment, silence is exile. Three faces of the same thing, all shaping the Tudor child into someone obedient, someone contained. Historians still argue whether these silences built stronger focus or simply trained fear. But you can imagine how heavy the hush must have felt after the meal. The punished boy stands, his bowl empty but his eyes downcast. He has eaten, but he has not shared. His voice is stiff in his throat, his lips almost unfamiliar with the shape of words. When he finally speaks again in class, his voice cracks slightly, like a door long rusted shut. You think about your own meals, perhaps with friends, family, even strangers in a cafe. Conversation flows, food tastes brighter with company. Strip away the voices, and even the best meal turns flat. Now imagine that every bite of your bread is a reminder of the words you are forbidden to say. That is the punishment here, not hunger, but enforced invisibility, oddly enough. Some boys tried to use silent meals to their advantage. They claimed to enjoy the peace, a break from the endless noise of recitation and chatter. But whether that was true or simply a mask for their embarrassment, no one really knows. Perhaps, in rare cases, silence did become a refuge rather than a cage. Still, as you sit in that drafty Tudor room, watching a boy chew his dry bread without a single word, you feel the weight of it. Punishment can bruise the skin, yes, but silence bruises the spirit, and somehow that bruise lingers longer. The day wears on, and you notice that punishments aren't only about physical pain or silent exclusion, they are also about the mind itself. In Tudor schools, memory is everything. A child who cannot recite his Latin verbs, his psalms, or even his multiplication tables is considered not just lazy, but morally weak. And when memory fails, punishment follows. You watch as the master points to a boy near the back. The boy rises slowly, knees still stiff from kneeling on peas earlier. He clasps his hands and begins to recite. His voice is thin, trembling, each word dragged up like water from a dry well. At first, he manages amo, amas, amat, but then his lips stumble, he hesitates. The next word vanishes from his mind. Silence swells, every pair of eyes boring into him. The master waits just long enough to stretch the tension, then strikes his palm with the rod. The boy flinches, stammers out the word, but by then his rhythm is broken. He falters again, and again the rod bites. The cruelty of this system is that memory is not perfect. The mind falters under pressure. Words slip away when you most need them. You know this from your own life, forgetting a password, blanking during a presentation. Now imagine that every blank space in your memory comes with physical pain. Suddenly, your brain is less a library and more a battlefield. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some masters demanded entire psalms by heart, and if the boy stumbled, he had to start again from the beginning. Forget line 12. Back to line 1. It was the Tudor equivalent of a video game where every mistake forces you to restart the level. Historians still argue whether this was a test of true memory or simply a sadistic trick to maximize mistakes. The fear of forgetting became its own punishment. Boys would study late into the night, whispering verses by candlelight, their eyes gritty with exhaustion. Some tried to tie knots in cords or scratch little marks on their slates to jog their memory. But woe to the one caught cheating those. Tricks often earned double punishment. You see another boy rise, shoulders stiff, and begin his recitation. His voice grows louder, steadier, and for a moment he shines, rattling off lines of Virgil with confidence. But then, one slip a wrong syllable and the master's rod cuts the air. The boy flinches, face falling, Even victory is fragile here. And you wonder, did any of them truly learn, or were they simply terrified into parroting words? Historians still argue whether Tudor education produced true scholars or merely skilled men. The debate continues, like a pendulum swinging between admiration and criticism. The punishments for failed memory weren't always physical. Sometimes a boy might be forced to stand for hours, reciting lines aloud until his voice cracked. Other times he might be ordered to wear a sign hung around his neck, declaring forgetful or idle. The humiliation was meant to brand his failure, to make him a living lesson for the others. Imagine it now, you're standing in front of your classmates, wooden sign digging into your chest, repeating the same verse again and again while the others smirk behind their hands. Each repetition feels heavier, your voice rasping, your throat dry. And yet you press on, because stopping would only earn another lash dot. The irony is that fear itself sabotages memory. You know this well. The more you panic about forgetting, the more likely you are to forget. A boy's heart pounds, his palms sweat, and the words he knew perfectly last night dissolve into nothing. Punishment breeds more forgetting, which breeds more punishment. It is a cruel cycle, spiraling endlessly. But there were moments of defiance, too. A boy might intentionally forget, speaking nonsense instead of Latin, earning the rod but reclaiming a shred of control. Or he might laugh through his punishment, mocking the very system designed to break him. These flashes of rebellion remind you that even under the weight of memory drills, children still found ways to be children. And so you sit there, listening to the endless recitation psalms, verbs, tables blurring together into a monotonous chant. The master's rod punctuates the air like a grim metronome. Your own mind begins to drift, half hypnotized by the rhythm, half panicked that you too might be called upon. You mouth the words silently, trying not to forget. The lesson drags on, and the punished boys slump back into their seats, eyes hollow, minds buzzing with lines half remembered. They know tomorrow will bring the same cycle: memorize, recite, forget, endure. You shiver at the thought of living in a world where forgetting is not a simple human flaw, but a crime against order. The afternoon grows longer, the windows spilling weak light that stretches across the wooden floor. You shift in your seat, sensing the next layer of punishment that has nothing to do with rods or ears or peas, but with ink. Endless ink. A boy nearby has just misbehaved, perhaps, he whispered during a recitation. Or perhaps his memory failed too many times in a row. The master does not lift the rod this time. Instead, he dips his quill into the inkwell, scratches out a phrase on a scrap of paper, and thrusts it forward. The boy takes it with dread, because he knows what it means. He must copy that line again and again until his hand cramps and the words lose all meaning. Idleness is the devil's pillow. The phrase glares back at him. He sets to work, writing it once, twice, 20 times. His quill scratches louder than the rest, as though every stroke is amplified by the humiliation. His hand begins to tremble after 30 lines. After 50, his letters blur into one another, blotches of ink blooming across the page like bruises. By the 100th, the phrase looks less like a warning and more like a spell cast to drain the boy's spirit. You watch the ink smear on his fingertips, staining them dark. He rubs his eyes with the back of his hand, and now there is ink on his cheek too, a black smudge like war paint, but not the heroic kind. It is the mark of punishment, as obvious as a bruise. Here's your quirky. Tidbit. Some masters demanded that lines be copied until a whole quire of paper was filled, which could mean hundreds upon hundreds of repetitions. A few accounts even mention boys being forced to copy in Latin Pagrecia est pulvina, diaboli, whether they understood the phrase or not. Historians still argue whether these excessive line punishments were truly educational or simply busy work. To keep restless hands occupied, the monotony itself becomes the punishment. Your wrist stiffens, your fingers cramp, and the words blur until they lose meaning. The boy beside you writes, "Idleness is the devil's pillow" so many times that, by the end, he spells pillow wrong, and that, of course, earns him more lines. It's a trap, a never-ending circle of ink. You glance at the growing pile of discarded sheets, corners curled, edges blotched. Each one is a testimony to tedium, a graveyard of repeated phrases. And the master, he glances at them with satisfaction, knowing the punishment has worked its way into bone and tendon. The sound is hypnotic. Scratch, scratch, blot. Scratch, scratch, blot. The other boys steal glances at the punished child, grateful it isn't their hands cramping into claws. One boy chuckles softly when the punished student drops a blob of ink so large it splatters across the page like a squashed beetle. The chuckle earns him a glare from the master and the threat of his own pile of lines. He goes silent immediately. Imagine yourself there, quill in hand, tasked with copying the same sentence 200 times. At first, you might try to keep the handwriting neat, hoping your diligence will earn mercy. But as fatigue sets in, the letters collapse into crooked scratches. Your ink runs dry, your wrist aches, and your eyes sting. You write more slowly, but slower writing means longer. Punishment. The pages multiply, your effort swallowed whole by repetition, and still the phrases sink into your mind. Even as your hand trembles, you find the words burned into your memory. Idleness is the devil's pillow. Idleness is the devil's pillow. When you close your eyes at night, the letters glow behind your eyelids. Perhaps that was the master's intention all along, not just to discipline your body, but to engrave his lessons into your very dreams. Oddly enough, some boys found small rebellions in this punishment. They would doodle tiny faces into the loops of letters, or write secret messages hidden within the lines. The master rarely noticed, too focused on the sheer quantity of work. And so, in a tiny way, the punishment became a canvas for mischief. You can almost picture a boy grinning faintly as he sneaks a little caricature of the master into the curl of a capital I. Still, the punishment drags on. Ink stains multiply, hands stiffen, shoulders ache. You watch as the punished boy dips his quill once more, eyelids heavy, writing a line he can no longer even see. The phrase blurs, his letters collapse into smudges, but the punishment demands completion. And so he continues, each scratch another drop of exhaustion, each blot another mark of defeat. By the time the master gathers the papers, the boy's fingers are black with ink, his desk littered with blotched sheets. He slumps forward, eyes half closed, but the lesson is burned into his bones. Misbehavior breeds monotony, and you find yourself blinking slowly, lulled by the steady rhythm of scratching quills, as though the punishment itself is designed to tire not only the boy, but you as well. The air in the room grows heavier, the walls pressing inward with that familiar hush of children trying very hard not to be noticed. You've seen rods, caps, peas, and ink-stained punishments, but now a new performance unfolds. This one is less about pain and more about putting shame on stage, turning the punished into entertainment for everyone else. The master, stern as ever, catches a boy dozing at his desk. His head has dipped too far forward, his quill dangling, dangerously close to blotting ink across the page. With a sharp rap of knuckles on the table, the boy jolts awake. The master doesn't reach for the rod this time. Instead, he claps his hands and calls for a mock trial. Immediately, the room stirs. Boys shift, straighten, and look around eagerly. Because this is not an ordinary punishment, it is theatre. The sleepy boy is dragged to the front, accused of the grave crime of idleness. A few classmates are assigned roles. One becomes the prosecutor, another the defense, a third the judge. The master himself presides, overseeing the absurd little trial. The charges are read aloud with exaggerated seriousness, while the accused shuffles his feet, red-faced, forced to play along. The jury, made up of the rest of the class, giggles behind their hands. The prosecutor lays out evidence. He closed his eyes 3 times during Latin. The defense stammers a weak excuse, perhaps blaming the dim light or the cold. The judge bangs a fist on the desk and declares the boy guilty. His sentence: to sing a psalm loudly and off-key while the others watch. You wince in sympathy as the boy begins. His voice cracks, rising unevenly, stumbling over words he doesn't know by heart. The class snickers, some whispering the correct words under their breath, others simply enjoying the spectacle. It is humiliation dressed as theatre, entertainment at the expense of the unlucky. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some accounts tell of boys being made to wear animal masks, crudely crafted from paper or cloth, and parade around the classroom, bleating like sheep or braying like donkeys. Whether this was a widespread custom or an isolated invention of particularly imaginative masters, historians still argue. But you can picture it vividly, can't you? A small boy, paper donkey ears flopping, forced to bray while his classmates howl with laughter. And the laughter is what stings most. Bruises fade, but laughter lodges in memory. A boy might still blush years later, remembering the moment he stood in front of the class, forced to sing, dance, or play the fool. For the others, it is entertainment. For him, it is exile. Yet there's something almost carnival-like about it. In a world where children have little power, watching a peer mocked offers a strange release. It's safer to laugh at him than to become him. The punished boy, in a way, sacrifices himself to keep the others safe for now. Tomorrow, the roles could be reversed. You imagine yourself standing there, the laughter prickling your skin like thorns. You try to keep your voice steady, but each chuckle makes your throat tighten. You sing faster, desperate to finish, but the master waves his hand, insisting you start again, this time louder. The humiliation stretches, each note another reminder of your mistake, and still the performance goes on. Sometimes the punishment is to carry a heavy book on your head while walking circles around the room. Sometimes it is to kneel and recite verses while classmates mimic and tease. Sometimes it is as silly as wearing your jacket backward or balancing a quill on your nose. The variations are endless, all designed to make one boy the clown for an afternoon. Historians debate whether these punishments were meant to truly correct behavior or simply to amuse boardmasters. Were they carefully designed lessons in humility, or were they theatre to break up the monotony of long school days? The truth is likely somewhere in between. You think back to your own childhood, those moments of being laughed at in class for a wrong answer, or tripping on your way to the board. Even without punishment, humiliation lingers. Now imagine that same laughter enforced by the teacher, structured into ritual. It doesn't just sting, it shapes the way you carry yourself forever after. The boy at the front finishes his song, cheeks blazing, voice trembling. The master nods, satisfied. The laughter dies down, and the boy returns to his seat, eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, silence fills the room again. But that silence carries the echo of laughter, buzzing in his ears long after the singing ends. And you shift uncomfortably in your chair, knowing that in Tudor classrooms, punishment wasn't always about bruises on the body, was just as often about bruises on pride. The schoolroom quiets after the laughter fades, but you begin to notice something darker lurking beneath the pattern of punishments. It isn't only about mistakes or misbehavior, it's also about who you are. In Tudor schools, the rod does not always fall equally. Privilege has a way of shielding some while magnifying the pain of others. You glance around the benches. The wealthier boys sit closer to the front, their clothes of finer wool, their hair trimmed neatly, shoes sturdier than the rest. Their families pay higher fees, perhaps even contribute gifts to the master sacks of grain, coins, or a warm cloak for winter. Behind them sit the poorer boys, their tunics patched, their boots worn thin, ink stains spread across sleeves that haven't seen proper washing in weeks. Both groups recite Latin together, but when mistakes come, the consequences divide. A wealthy boy stumbles over his verbs, fumbling amas into nonsense. The master frowns, but instead of raising the rod, he clears his throat and gently corrects him. "Try again," he says, his tone firm but measured. The boy nods, blushes, and begins again. No rod, no peas, just patience. Moments later, a poorer boy falters in the same way. The rod rises immediately. His hand is struck hard, the crack echoing through the room. His knuckles redden, his lip trembles, but no one objects. It is simply the order of things. You realize then, punishment is not only a tool of discipline, but also a mirror of social hierarchy. A noble's son is too valuable to bruise. A farmer's son is expendable, his body a canvas for the rod. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some schools even had official rules that noble boys should never be flogged. Instead, they were punished with scolding, extra lessons, or in rare cases, the humiliation of a dunce cap. Historians still argue how strictly these rules were enforced, but enough accounts survive to suggest that many masters dared not risk angering powerful parents. Better to save the harsher punishments for those who lacked protectors. Imagine the bitterness this breeds. You sit in the back, hands swollen from repeated blows, while at the front a noble boy enjoys gentler correction for the very same mistake. Resentment simmers, but it cannot be voiced. To complain is to risk even harsher treatment. So you swallow your anger, just as you swallow your dry bread at mealtime. And yet, there is a strange flip side. Some noble parents, eager for their sons to appear hardy and disciplined, instructed masters not to spare the rod entirely. They believed too much coddling would soften their heirs. But even then, the punishments tended to be symbolic, 1 or 2 strikes, carefully measured, never enough to leave lasting marks. The performance of severity without its true sting. For poorer boys, however, the rod sings freely. Each mistake, each whisper, each slouch earns another blow. They carry the marks home on their hands, their legs, sometimes even their shoulders. Parents rarely protest, because to them, education itself is already a gift. Better a sun whip. in school, then left ignorant in the fields. Historians still argue whether this divide was absolute or whether some masters treated all boys with equal severity. There are tales of famously harsh teachers who whipped noble and common alike, their reputation so fearsome that parents dared not intervene. But more often, the scales tipped toward privilege, the rod falling hardest on those least able to resist. You can feel the weight of that injustice pressing in the room. The poorer boys hunch lower, trying to make themselves invisible. The wealthier ones sit straighter, secure in their insulation. The master, rod in hand, glances between them, his choices, silently reinforcing the social order outside the classroom. Education here is not just about Latin and Psalms, it is about learning one's place. And yet, every once in a while, the balance tips. A noble boy grows too bold, too cocky, too sure of his immunity. The master, exasperated, lets the rod fall. Across his hand, the room holds its breath. For that brief moment, the playing field feels even. The poorer boys watch closely, eyes wide, savoring the sight of privilege cracked, if only for an instant. But the moment passes quickly. The noble boy is scolded, perhaps made to copy a few lines, while the rod resumes its steady rhythm against less protected hands. The order reasserts itself. You sit back, unsettled. It isn't just about punishment, it's about power, about who suffers and who escapes. The Tudor classroom, like the Tudor world, is stitched together by inequity, and in every sting of the rod, in every spared strike, the children learn the lesson most deeply of all. Some pain is optional, depending on your name. Your gaze shifts toward the quieter corner of the room, where the boys are absent and a smaller group of girls sit with lowered eyes, their needles flashing in and out of cloth. It is easy to forget that Tudor girls, when they received formal education at all, were taught under very different rules. Here, punishment takes on another face, not rods and ear twists so often, but silence, shame, and the constant reminder of their limited place. You notice a girl's hand falter as she stitches. A crooked seam mars the neat row of thread. She glances nervously upward, hoping the mistress or sometimes the same schoolmaster hasn't noticed. But of course, nothing escapes the teacher's eye. A sharp rebuke follows, not with a rod but with words, harsh, cutting, and designed to sink deep. Slovenly, the master snaps. No husband will want such careless hands. The other girls bow their heads lower, needles moving faster, as if each stitch might mend not only the cloth but their own chances at respectability. The punishments here are subtler, but no less cruel. A girl may be forced to unpick every thread of her faulty seam, then begin again while the others watch her fall behind. Or she may be ordered to sit in silence for an hour, her work confiscated, her humiliation plain. Unlike the boys, whose mistakes are met with noise, the crack of the rod, the laughter of mock trials, the girls' errors are smothered under a blanket of silence. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some accounts, girls were forced to wear a padlock and chain around their tongues for speaking out of turn, a device more symbolic than practical. Whether that truly happened in Tudor classrooms or is a later exaggeration, historians still argue, but the imagery is chilling, the very organ of speech restrained, punishing not just noise, but the very idea of a girl's voice. You watch as one girl fidgets, her foot tapping restlessly under the bench. The mistress notices and commands her to stand still, hands clasped, eyes fixed downward. She must remain that way for the rest of the lesson, her body aching with stillness, her pride gnawed by the watchful stares of her peers. The punishment is not to be struck, but to be made invisible, erased into obedience. Even when the rod is used, it tends to be lighter, more symbolic. A tap across the knuckles, enough to sting, but not enough to welt. Society demanded that girls remain unmarked, their bodies unblemished, their discipline carried inwards rather than written across their skin. Yet the fear of that light tap still hung heavy, for it carried the weight of disapproval far greater than the pain itself. You realize then how different the lessons are. Boys are trained for authority through blows and humiliation designed to harden them. Girls are trained for silence through punishments that curb their speech, their movement, their very presence. Both sets of punishments prepare them for the world outside, but the worlds they will enter are starkly divided. Historians still argue whether Tudor girls resented these limits or accepted them as natural. Some letters and diaries suggest frustration, a yearning for the freedom of books and voices. Others seem to embrace the quiet, priding themselves on patience and skill. But here, in this small room, the atmosphere feels heavy. Each stitch, each quiet sigh, each downcast eye is part of a discipline that seeps deeper than any rod. You imagine yourself sitting among them, needle trembling in your hand. Your eyes blur from the strain of small stitches in dim light. You long to whisper to the girl beside you, to share a small joke about the mistress's crooked cap. But you know the risk. A single laugh, and you might find yourself unpicking every thread, condemned to silence while the others press ahead. Your mistake becomes not only a punishment for you, but a reminder to the others. The girls' punishments are not loud spectacles. They are quiet erosions of self, reminders of their narrow path. The boys may leave with bruised hands and swollen knuckles, but they leave still encouraged to speak, to argue, to master their Latin. The girls leave quieter than they arrived, voices trimmed away like uneven threads. You shift in your seat, unsettled. Here, punishment is not about pain, it is about silence. And silence, as you have already seen in this schoolroom, can bruise deeper than any rod. The classroom grows colder as the afternoon light fades, and with it comes a new kind of weight, not just the rod, not just the cone, but the weight of the Psalms. Religion is never far from these walls, and punishment often arrives dressed in piety. You sit straighter as the master clears his throat and orders a boy to rise. It is time to recite the appointed psalm of the day. The boy's voice quavers, the familiar rhythm of sacred words tumbling from his lips. But then hesitation, a missed word, a stumble. His tongue trips where it should soar. The master wastes no time. The rod snaps across the boy's hand, sharp as ever, but now accompanied by a solemn rebuke. The word of God is not to be mangled. The boy bows his head lower, cheeks red, not just with pain, but with shame of a spiritual sort. You realize that punishment here is not simply about discipline, it is about salvation. To fail in Latin might earn you a welt, but to fail in Scripture might be branded as failing the Almighty Himself. The rod, in this moment, is wielded as much for the soul as for the body. Imagine the tension, a small child, voice trembling, tasked with carrying the weight of divine words. His lips falter, and suddenly the sting on his knuckles carries the echo of eternal judgment. No wonder his hands shake. No wonder his words collapse under the pressure. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some accounts mention that punished children were forced to copy psalms backward, line by line, as a way of undoing their errors. Whether this was a widespread practice or simply the eccentricity of certain zealots Historians still argue, but you can imagine the confusion of scratching out holy words in reverse. The letters bending awkwardly, the meaning vanishing into nonsense. Sometimes punishment came in the form of extra prayers, long hours, kneeling, repeating psalms until voices cracked and minds grew numb. At first, it may have seemed merciful, but soon the repetition blurred sacred words into little more than noise. The spiritual blended with the punitive, until even prayer felt like punishment. The master, for his part, seemed to relish this combination. When a boy misbehaved, it wasn't enough to call him idle, he was called sinful. When a girl faltered in her stitching hymns, it wasn't just clumsiness, it was the punishments, wrapped in religious language, carved shame deeper than any welt. You picture yourself kneeling on the cold stone, your knees pressed into hardness, your lips forming words again and again. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The irony is sharp. You want warmth, you want food, you want freedom from the sting of the rod, but your voice drones on, each repetition a hammer striking the same spot in your mind. Historians still argue whether this religious severity truly shaped children's souls or simply dulled their faith. Some suggest it produced generations of devout believers, reverent and disciplined. Others argue it created resentment, teaching children to associate God with punishment rather than comfort. The truth may be tangled somewhere in between, and yet, in quieter moments, there is something strangely tender to a boy reciting perfectly, his voice clear, might receive not the rod but a nod of approval. The Psalms, when mastered, could feel like protection. Scripture as shield, punishment as shadow. One moment salvation, the next humiliation. The line between the two is paper thin, and you realize that in Tudor classrooms, religion was both balm and blade. To recite correctly was to rise higher. To stumble was to fall harder. The day stretches on, and the rhythm of punishment feels almost liturgical now. Rod, recitation, prayer, silence. A cycle as unbreakable as the church bells outside. You lean back, weary just from watching, and wonder how many of these children grew up with faith, and how many grew up with only fear. The rod rests for a moment, the psalms fade, and you notice something strange. You are not only watching children being punished, but occasionally the masters themselves come under scrutiny. The Tudor schoolroom, for all its rigid hierarchy, was not a place where teachers ruled without risk. Parents, patrons, and even local officials sometimes turned the rod back on the master. You picture it, the master, normally so commanding, suddenly summoned before a wealthy patron. Perhaps a noble father has heard whispers that his son's knuckles are swollen too often, or that a welt across the shoulders has lingered longer than decency allows. The master bows low, murmurs apologies, his authority shrinking in the presence of someone more powerful. Some parents accepted severity, even encouraged it, repeating the old maxim that the rod makes the scholar. But others drew lines. Too many bruises, too much humiliation, and the master risked losing his post or worse, his reputation, in a world where a teacher's livelihood depended on patronage and fees. A whisper of cruelty could empty a classroom faster than the winter. Wind empties trees. You imagine the awkward conversations, a mother approaching after lessons, her voice tight with concern. Did you strike him across the face? The master insists it was only a tap. The boy insists it stung like fire. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, and the argument simmers. Masters walked a fine line, balancing discipline with diplomacy. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one recorded case, A schoolmaster in London was actually dragged before the town council because he was accused of beating boys so harshly that blood was drawn. Whether the charges were exaggerated by rival teachers or true, historians still argue. But the fact remains, schoolmasters could be punished too, and not always gently. Sometimes the punishment was public shame. A master might be warned in front of the townsfolk, his reputation tarnished. Sometimes he was quietly dismissed, forced to wander to another parish in search of work. And occasionally, in rare cases, the community itself retaliated angry parents gathering to confront a teacher, their voices louder than any rod. You realize then that the rod held two edges. It gave the master power, yes, but it also placed him under constant scrutiny. Too soft, and he was mocked as weak, unable to control his pupils. Too harsh, and he was accused of cruelty, risking his livelihood. The balance was precarious, every strike carrying weight beyond the classroom, and sometimes the children themselves resisted in quieter ways. A boy might hide the rod, tucking it behind a bench or tossing it into a hearth when the master's back was turned. A girl might exaggerate her bruises when she returned home, ensuring her parents would intervene. Small acts of rebellion that could ripple outward, undermining the teacher's authority in ways he could not predict. Historians debate whether these moments of accountability made Tudor education gentler over time, or whether they were simply isolated incidents. Did masters truly temper their punishments because of parental oversight, or did they merely become more discreet? The truth, as always, is blurred. You imagine being that teacher, rod in hand, glancing toward the door with unease. Will the next knock bring a parent with praise or with fury? You picture his shoulders tense, his voice forced calm, as he defends his choices before wealthy patrons whose children sit immune in the front row. Authority, you realize, is never absolute. It bends and wavers like the birch rod itself. For the children, this tension was invisible most of the time. But occasionally, when a master returned from a scolding with his own pride bruised, the classroom felt different. His voice might soften for a day, his punishments less severe. Or, conversely, he might lash out harder, as if to reclaim authority lost outside the school walls. Either way, the pupils learned another quiet lesson. Even those who wielded the rod were not free from its shadow. You shift uneasily. For a moment, the master no longer feels like the unshakable tyrant of the room. He seems smaller, his authority fragile, his punishments shaped as much by fear as by discipline, and that realization makes the atmosphere feel heavier still. The schoolroom feels hushed again, but now your mind drifts outward beyond the cracked benches and the quills scratching in ink, into the realm of historians who have tried to piece this world together. For centuries, people have argued about just how severe these Tudor punishments truly were. Did children endure daily beatings and humiliations? Or have later storytellers exaggerated the cruelty to make the past look more barbaric than it really was? You picture yourself in a library centuries after the fact, parchments spread across a desk, scholars muttering in candlelight. One insists the rod was constant, the birch swinging every hour. Another shakes his head, arguing that most punishments were light, symbolic, the tales of bloody knuckles, little more than Victorian embellishments. Even now, the debate has never quite settled. Some diaries from the time hint at severity. Boys, right of aching hands, bruised shoulders, humiliation that clung to them like smoke. Yet other records soften from masters themselves portray discipline as measured correction, claiming the rod was used rarely only for the most stubborn. Offences, you can almost hear the defensive tone. We did not beat, we instructed. Which version do you believe? Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, when school reformers wanted to prove how enlightened their own methods were, they painted Tudor education in especially grim colours. They described salted rods, endless kneeling, boys collapsing. Under blows, historians still argue whether those reformers were telling the truth or simply making their ancestors look cruel to highlight their own progress. In other words, was the Tudor rod really that sharp, or did the Victorians sharpen it further in memory? You sit in the schoolroom, hearing echoes of both sides. The rod in the corner looks menacing enough, but you wonder, did it strike as often, as the stories say, or does it loom larger because of the fear it symbolized? After all, sometimes the mere threat of punishment is enough. The rod need not sing every date's silent presence. Might have done the work. There is also debate about how children themselves felt. Some letters suggest resentment, boys complaining bitterly of their sore hands. Others recall discipline almost fondly, insisting it taught respect and sharpened the memory. Was that genuine gratitude, or simply the long shadow of survival adults justifying the pain they endured? As children, historians also puzzle over how widespread punishments like dunce caps or kneeling on peas really were. Were they everyday tools of discipline, or rare oddities magnified by chroniclers who loved strange details? Imagine one particularly creative master forcing a child to kneel on nutshells, and that story spreading until everyone believed it was common practice. A single cruel invention can grow into legend if repeated often enough. Even the numbers are debated. How many strokes of the rod were typical? Some say 3, symbolic and swift. Others describe dozens, brutal enough to draw blood. The truth, perhaps, depended entirely on the master's temperament and the boy's misstep. You realize then that your journey tonight is built on facts tangled with folklore. Discipline mixed with drama, the image of the Tudor classroom, is reconstructed piece by piece, each historian painting it differently. One sees cruelty, another sees order, a third sees exaggeration. And yet, sitting here in this drafty room of the imagination, the punishments feel vivid enough to sting across centuries. And perhaps that is the point. Whether every detail is fact or embellishment, the memory of those punishments has power. They have become symbols, shaping how we think of education in the past. Even if salted rods were rare, the story of them survives because it captures the harshness of a world where childhood was not cushioned, where learning was paid for in bruises and tears. You glance once more at the master, rod resting lightly. In his hand, was he truly cruel or simply a man of his time, repeating the discipline expected of him? Historians still argue. You feel yourself leaning one way, then another, never quite sure. And maybe that uncertainty is the truest lesson. Of all, the past is never as clear as we want it to be. The candlelight flickers low, the day in the Tudor classroom finally drawing to its weary close. The punishments you've witnessed, the rod, the cap, the peas, the ink, the silences, the humiliations do not vanish when the lesson ends. They echo outward, shaping the way children grow. And if you squint a little, you can still see faint shadows of them in classrooms today. Think of it, the ruler wrapped across knuckles in the 20th century. The write 100 times homework. Assignment, the standing into corner, exile all discipline, even the dunce cap lingers in language. Call someone a dunce, and you're conjuring that paper cone, centuries after the stool was packed away. The echoes ripple further than the rod itself ever reached. You picture a modern classroom, bright posters, smooth desks, colorful pens. There is no birch rod leaning in the corner, but the air still hums with the possibility of punishment. A teacher raises an eyebrow, and a child straightens in fear of scolding. Detention slips replace salted rods, but the principle is the same. Behavior corrected by discomfort, whether physical, social, or mental. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some rural British schools, the practice of caning persisted well into the late 20th century. Long after Tudor times were considered the distant past, historians still argue whether this persistence represents tradition or simply reluctance to let go of the rod. You realize then that echoes of Tudor punishments aren't just metaphors, they stretched forward, alive far longer than you might expect. And yet, there is also transformation. Today, psychologists debate whether punishment teaches discipline or merely fear an argument that Tudor masters would have laughed off, rod already raised. But now, the pendulum swings differently. Instead of kneeling on peas, a child might be told to reflect in a quiet room. Instead of singing a psalm as humiliation, he might write an apology letter. Punishment still exists, but its costume is changed. Imagine yourself drifting through these layers of time. One moment, you are kneeling on peas in a freezing classroom, your lips whispering amo, amas, amat. The next, you are in a modern school, tapping a pencil nervously in detention. Different tools, different walls, yet the same principle, authority. Enforced through discomfort, the line from Tudor to today is thin but unbroken. Historians still argue whether we have truly moved past the old spirit of discipline. Some say yes, that education now values encouragement over fear. Others point to quiet humiliations that persist. The student called out in front of the class, the child labeled as slow, the lingering sting of being laughed at by peers. The dunce cap may be gone, but its shadow lingers in whispered giggles. You lean back, weary from the journey, and let the echoes settle. Perhaps the true punishment of Tudor classrooms isn't just the rod or the cap, it is the memory of them, echoing forward, reminding us of a world where education and pain walked hand in hand, and those echoes, faint but persistent, still hum in the corners of classrooms today and now. As the last candle sputters low, let yourself drift with me into a gentler rhythm. The birch rod is set aside, the peas swept into a corner, the dunce cap folded away. The children shuffle home through cobbled streets, their voices rising softly into the evening air. The master closes the door, and silence finally returns, not punishment this time, but peace. You too can loosen your shoulders now. The sting of rods, the weight of silence, the bite of humiliation, all of it fades like smoke curling into the night sky. Your breath slows. The images soften, a wooden bench becoming a cloud, a dunce cap dissolving into a harmless paper cone drifting on the breeze. The schoolroom grows dimmer, the walls stretch away, the ink stains blur, the rod melts into shadow. You are no longer in Tudor England, you are here, in your quiet room, listening to the steady rhythm of your own breath. Each inhale is lighter, each exhale softer, carrying away the weight of the day. Remember this, history can sting, yes, but it can also lull. Tonight, the punishments you witnessed are only echoes, their sharp edges worn smooth by time. Let those echoes fade now, drifting further and further until they are no louder than the hum of a distant fan. Your eyes grow heavy, your body melts into the bed, and as the last candle of Tudor discipline burns out in your imagination, you surrender to something gentler, comfort and sleep. Good night and sweet dreams.